responsive color and responsive typography, and they're actually two totally different presentations, so I'm just going to go through one and go through the other. They're not long presentations, so I should be done in an hour and a half or so. We'll have time for questions at the end. So responsive color, this presentation is not just about color and responsive design. It's kind of an introduction to color and CSS, just to make sure everybody understands how that works. And then it goes into what you can do with color in CSS, as far as like using stats to change what you're doing with colors. And then at the end of this presentation, I'll talk about some of the considerations with color, like how people perceive color and the usability around color. My Twitter name is up there. It's Clarissa with 1 R and 2 S's if anybody's tweeting about this. I'm going to post the slides online, so don't feel like you have to write down URLs or anything like that. But the slides are mostly pictures, so you might want to take notes if I tell you anything that you think is interesting. Anybody in here colorblind, by the way? Oops. Ooh. So I'm not going to talk about that much in this presentation, but there might be things that you don't understand because you can't see what I'm talking about. So color is made up of light. Light is received by the eye, and the different colors of light come in and combine to create a color. And when you're looking at light, color has additive properties, and they add together. It's not like paint where you subtract. With colors you add, like red, green, and blue are the primary colors in light, and added together they create white, which is the opposite of paint where you'd add red, green, and blue or whatever and then turn black. So it's an important thing to remember when you're thinking about how color is displayed on the screen. So all the colors together, you can see in the middle here, comes out to white. If you have no color at all, then that's black. I'm going to tell you about 3 different things that are basically determine what a color is: their hue, value, and saturation. The first of these is hue, and that's what we think of when we think of color, like red or blue or green or yellow. That's the hue. It's the color, with what's in our head, our idea of what color is. These colors in the hue, that's the purest value of the color, so it's like straight red or straight blue or whatever. And then value and saturation affect how that color looks. Value is the lightness or darkness of a hue. So if you have blue, it's a dark blue or a light blue. And that's adding white or black to the color in the light to make it be a certain color. So for example, here we have purple in the middle. The middle is pure purple. If we add white, we get what's on the left, which are lighter values, and what's black is on the right, and that's the dark colors of purple. And value is actually the most important part of determining what a color is. Hue, which I just told you about, the part that tells you if it's red or green or whatever, that seems like it should be the most important, but it's actually not. It's the second part, value, the lightness or darkness, that determines what we see. And you notice when you look at this picture, if you take all the color out, everything is still recognizable to you. You can still recognize the people and the trees and everything in the picture without any hue at all. There's no red or green or anything like that. You don't need the hue to be able to visually see things and know what they are. You need the value. If we had a hue without any value, no lightness or darkness, everything, we'd just be basically looking at blankness. We wouldn't be able to see anything. But you can have value lightness without any hue in it. The third part of color is saturation. This is the intensity of the hue, how bright it is or how faint it is. For example, here we have at the top a red that's fully saturated, and that means it's a bright, pure red. And then it goes down to the bottom where it's gray, which is an unsaturated red. And it's the most intense color at the top, which is fully saturated, going down to the less saturated, dull, or muted color. And all these things are important because they determine how you say what a color is when you're doing CSS, how you pick the correct number to describe a color. This is an example of the image that's fully saturated. You can see there's bright colors in here. There's purple and pink and orange. They're very bright and full. To desaturate it, it looks like this. So basically when we're desaturating something, we're adding gray to the color. So everything just kind of looks pale and muted. And I sometimes have trouble remembering the difference between saturation and value. Saturation is adding gray to the color, whereas value is adding white or black. So if I took that same picture and added white, it would look like this. So, if you look at them, like in one sense, they both look like they're lighter colors, but this is adding gray, and this is adding white. If you had black, it would look like this, where it's much darker. So So the color numbers that we use in CSS then are derived from this red, green, and blue that come from the light when we see a color. And when you have a screen that's a computer screen or a TV screen or a phone screen, the way it works, obviously you have pixels. The screen is filled with pixels that are each a different color. Each pixel is made up of three subpixels, red, green, and blue. And then when you tell the computer what color a certain pixel is supposed to be, it gives a different intensity of each of the three subpixels, red, green, and blue, that mix together to make the correct color for that pixel. So the actual subpixels look different depending on the type of the screen. But if you went and zoomed in really far to any type of screen, whether it's a TV or a computer, you're always going to see the red, green, and blue subpixels in there that are going to combine to make colors. So CSS colors usually use some form of RGB notation, which includes hex numbers, which you're probably most familiar with. Now, does everybody here know some HTML and CSS? Nobody's like a pure designer. Are there any pure designers that don't know any code? Okay, that's good. So for each of the different colors, there's 256 possible values in how much of that red, green, or blue we're going to get off the screen. So if we multiply these 256 times 256 times 256, we get more than 16 million unique combinations. That's 16 million unique colors that can come off of the screen. And the human eye can't actually differentiate that many colors. You know, if we had two that are right next to each other, our eyes wouldn't tell the difference. But there's all these different possible colors that you can tell a screen to create. So there's a few different notations then in CSS to specify color. The first is RGB notation. And that, we're just having three numbers to say how much red, green, and blue we want to combine to make a certain color on the screen. And for each of the three numbers, it's an integer between 0 and 255. Remember, there's a total of 256 values, but we're starting with 0 here, so it only goes up to 255. And then this is the CSS notation. You just say color, RGB, and then in parentheses you have the three numbers, the red, green, and blue. So here we have red, which is 200 out of 255. Green is 0, blue is 100 out of 255. So it's more red and less blue, and that's what color it works out to. So it's pretty straightforward, kind of hard to visualize in your head how a color is going to come up though. If you have 255, the highest value for all three of the numbers, that's white. Remember, because if you take red and green and blue and combine them, it turns to white. If you have 0 for all three numbers, that's black, because there's no light at all. If you have any other combination where all three numbers are exactly the same, then it's gray, because no color dominates over the other colors. You can also do RGB using percentage, so instead of going 0 to 255, you go 0 to 100 in percentages. It works the same, so just it's a little bit easier to understand in your head because it's easier to pick like half of 100 in your head than half of 255 or to do any portion of that. You can't mix integers and percentages in the same declaration. It has to be one or the other, but you can use different ways of doing the color on the same website, of course. You can do RGB or hex or the different types of RGB, as long as they're not mixed in the exact same declaration on one element. When you have a 0 here, this is really important. The 0 has to have the percentage sign in there. It's unlike other things in CSS. If you have like 0 pixels or something like that, you can just do 0 without the unit on it. But here, when you have 0%, it has to have that percentage sign. So hex you're probably more familiar with, because this is what we learned to do first when we learned to do colors in CSS, because this is how, when they first started doing color in HTML, this is what they used. So hex works exactly the same way, though. There's R, G, and B. Each of them are 2 digits with numbers ranging from 00 to FF. So like that, the first 2 digits are red, the second 2 are green, the last 2 are blue. And the way that these numbers work, the letters are actually numbers. And a lot of people do hex and they don't actually understand how these are actual numbers, so I want to explain that just to make sure you understand, because it's really important. When we think of numbers, we go like 0 to 10, and and then there's a tens place. So we have, it's called a base 10 system of numbering. Once you get to 10, then you have like the next column over. Hex numbers, they actually are base 16. So once you get to 9, the number after 9, what we think of 10 is the letter A. What we think of 11 is the letter B, and so on. F is 15, and then the next one, because it's base 16, it's 1, 0. So it's 1, 16, and then 0 in the ones place. So it's a little bit confusing because, I mean, you count to 10 your whole life. That's how numbers work to you. But that's kind of an arbitrary thing that humans came up with. There's not really, you know, a reason why it has to be 10, 10, 10. You know, other cultures in history actually use base 16 or other number systems, which is kind of interesting. So 0, 0 to FF, the 16, using the base 16 numbers works well because 16 times 16 is 256. So having the full value of F in both digits is 256, our top number. And you're always going to use a leading 0 if it's a single digit because you need a total of 6 digits there. So here we have a color where the number is A9, which is the red, C8, which is the green, and 6-2, which is the blue. So pretty straightforward. Sometimes you'll have numbers where the digits, each set of 2 are the same digit, like AA, 99, CC. And you can actually use shorthand with this, only if every set of 2 is the same, and shorten it to 3 instead of 6. And that just saves you a little typing sometimes. And then there's a totally different system of doing colors in CSS called HSL. And this is really interesting and actually a lot more intuitive. So if you're doing colors and putting them on a page, it's worth learning this because you'll find it useful. Instead of having 3 numbers that are red, green, and blue, the 3 numbers are hue, saturation, and lightness. Remember those 3 properties I talked about at the beginning. HSL actually isn't supported in 98 and older, so if you're needing to support older browsers, you have to do a fallback color. But if you can use it on your site, it's something to consider because it's going to totally change how you think about color. So the first number is the hue. Remember, that's the color, the red or the green or whatever it is. And our first number here is 120, and that's green. And the way you figure out the number is all the colors are on a wheel going around. It's 360 degrees on the wheel. Starting with 0 for red, going around to 360, also is red. So once you have a sense of where the numbers on the wheel are, it's really easy to figure out what color you're starting with. So we have 120, which is our green. So we're starting with the green, and then we're going to change the saturation and lightness. So the second number, the 100%, is saturation. So that's a full saturation, so that means this is a green with no gray added to it. If the number was lower, the color would be more gray, or less saturated. The third number is lightness, which is the same as our value, which was the amount of black or white in the color. 50% means it's a normal color. A higher number means it's a lighter color, and a lower number is a darker color. So here we have green, 100% saturation, and normal with no lightness or darkness. So it just comes out to plain green. So it's a little bit different than RGB, or it's actually a lot different than RGB. The numbers are totally different, but once you get a sense of how they work, it's a lot easier to think of a color in your head and make numbers out of it. You can't really do that in hex or RGB unless you've memorized the colors or it's a simple color. I mean, if you have like A3, 6, 7, F2, I mean, nobody knows what that is. You're going to have to look it up. But with HSL, you can look at the first number and go, okay, this is some shade of green. It's really saturated and it's dark or light. So you can actually picture it in your head or go the other direction and make up a number when the color is in your head. So for example, let's say we wanted to make this color less saturated. We would just change the second number of saturation to maybe a smaller number like 50 and then make it less saturated. If we wanted to make the color darker, we just change the third color, which is lightness, to a low number, like 20%. If we wanted to make it lighter, change that third number to 80%. So it's pretty simple. We have named colors in CSS, which are not actually that useful because, basically you usually want a specific color that's not one of the named colors. But the name colors are useful to know. Sometimes they're just quicker to type out. They're the English name of a color, like red or green or light blue, assigned to a numerical value. There were 16 name colors in HTML3 when they started. Now in CSS level 3, there's 147 colors. And this shows all of them here, all of the name colors. You can see that there's pretty many, and they have some pretty unusual names like Blanche Almond and Rosie Brown, and I don't know who came up with these, but they're kind of weird. Each of them has a different value, except the grays, because you know, when you're writing gray, does gray have an A in it or an E in it? Like nobody ever has any idea, like gray or gray. I always spell it wrong. So they made it so all the grays can go either way, so you don't have to remember whether to put an A or an E in your gray. I think that's really smart, actually. So when you're doing color, besides the actual color and saturation and the lightness, there's also opacity, which is whether or not there's transparency in the color. Can you see what's behind it? And the browser does this by post-processing. That means it determines the color first, and then it looks at what's behind it and figures out how to blend the colors together. The number systems are almost exactly the same, except it adds a fourth number at the end, an extra channel, which is alpha. The A stands for alpha, which is a measure of opacity. So if you're doing RGB numbers, instead of RGB and then the parentheses, it'd be RGBA in parentheses. And then you have the same first three numbers, and then the fourth number, it goes from 0, which is fully transparent, to 1, which is fully opaque. So here we have one of them is 1, so that's opaque, and the second number, the last number is 0.5, which is halfway transparent. So it can be any decimal number between 0 and 1. And you can do this either using the integers or the percentages for the first three numbers. And then this is what it would look like. Here I have a colored box that's in front of the text. So the top one, the opacity of the box that I assigned to the color is 1, so you can't see anything behind the box. And then going down, there's more and more transparent, so you can actually see the text behind the box. And you notice when you look at the red on there, it changes the color of the red. So it's kind of a mixture, like when the second box, the red and blue mix together, so the text actually looks kind of purple in there. There's actually an opacity property in CSS, which you might have used, that you can assign to any element. And this works a little bit differently. Right here, what you see on the screen, I've applied opacity to this entire element. But that makes everything transparent. I think I put it at 70%. So the border, the text, and the background in that rectangle are all transparent, which means you can see what's behind them. But if you're using RGBA, only the part you apply the color to is transparent. So I used RGBA for the background, the white on there, and made that transparent, but I didn't make the border and the text transparent. So this is a lot more useful because you have more control over what parts are transparent. If I wanted to do something like this where I have text in front of a picture, but I have like a transparent background, you don't want to make the text transparent because it'll be harder to read. You want the text to be full on there. So by only applying the transparency via RGBA to the background and not the other parts of the element, then everything else remains the pure color. And this is what the code for it would look like. The color for the text and the color for the border are just RGB with the 3 numbers. Then the background color is the RGBA with the 4 numbers, and the last one is 0.7, so it's 70% opacity. It's really important when you do RGB and RGBA to remember to do the right one for how many numbers you have. So if you have 4 numbers, it has to be RGBA and not RGB. And if you screw that up, the browser might not be able to recognize and know what you're doing. There's also color transparent, which basically is just the same thing as full transparency and no color. So that's just a shortcut. There's HSLA, which is the same theory. I just showed you HSL a minute or 2 ago. This just also adds the 4th number for transparency. So again, we have a hue, saturation, lightness, and then transparency. So once you put this into CSS, there's a lot of things you can apply color to. And some of them are pretty basic, and you already know them. You can apply color to the text like that. It's pretty simple. You can apply a background color. You can apply a border color. You can actually have a different color on each side of the box. Something not everybody knows is you also can do an outline color, which is like a second border that goes around the border. It's kind of cool. It's not part of the box model. It actually goes outside of the box model for when you're sizing the element. And it's supported by most browsers, but not all of them. The kind of odd thing about outline color, it has to be the same color all the way around. But this is kind of a nifty trick if you want to put 2 different color borders around something. You can do color on a text shadow. Here you can see the shadow behind the text. You can have multiple text shadows. This isn't supported by every browser, unfortunately. And you can do box shadow in different colors. And you can have multiple box shadows behind any element. Something that's kind of interesting, you can even change the color of text highlighting from the browser default. You can see, it's hard to see on the screen, but the last 3 letters are highlighted, and you can change that color for your website. So when people go to highlight things on the website, they'll be a different color than what they've selected in their browser. So those are just a few of the interesting things you can do with color on a website. And then SAS, how many people here have ever used SAS before? How many people actually know what it is? So a couple people don't know what SAS is, so I'm going to explain it really quick. SAS is a preprocessor. And what that means is it's a method you can use to write shortcuts in your CSS. There's different things you can do. And the preprocessor basically means that you're going to have a program on your computer that takes the SAS that you wrote and it pre-processes it, turns it into CSS before it goes to the browser. So you're still sending regular old CSS to the browser, but you're writing shortcuts on your computer that get processed into that CSS. So I'll give you some examples of what you can do with SAS as far as color that just makes it easier to do certain things, and there's some cool tricks you can do with it. One of the most basic things in SAS are color variables. And what it is you have a variable, say green, it's $green, and I can assign any color to that, and then anywhere in my style sheet I can refer to this color just by doing $green, and it'll replace that with the text value, or whatever the color is. I could do RGB or anything else there too. So when your SAS processes this, it changes it into this CSS, which is what's sent to the browser. Remember, the browser still gets regular old CSS, but this thing that you wrote is a little bit different, and you use this variable, and that means you can use the same color over and over again on your site without having to remember that the green on the site is 278232. I mean, you're never going to remember that, but if you remember that, you know, the green in your brand color that you use for everything, if you just call it $green, you're going to remember that, and you can just type it in. And that's handy too if at some point they change the colors a little bit. Like if somebody says, well, you know, this is nice, but I want this green to be a little bit lighter everywhere. You know, if you just had regular CSS, you'd have to go change it like 300 places, right? But if you have a variable, you just change it once, and then all the places where you put in $green, it would have the new color in there. So lighten and darken are 2 pretty cool things you can do in SAS to change the colors using SAS functions. And this changes the hue and makes it lighter or darker. So what you have is lighten, and then in parentheses you have the color, and then a comma, and then the % you want to lighten it. So you can either use a color variable here or put the actual color in hex or RGB. So this is the code that you have on your site. You say maybe purple is this hex color. I'm going to show you what this turns out to be. It'll be 2 boxes. The first one with the background color of purple. The second one with the background color, I'm going to lighten the purple by 20%. So when that goes through the preprocessor, the SAS is going to turn it into this, just 2 lines that are the background color for the 2 boxes. So I only specified the first color, and SAS automatically came up with the second color for me. And this is what it looked like. You have a purple box, and then one that's 20% lighter. There's also darken, which does the opposite. It adds black to the color instead of white. In the same format, darken, and then your color or your variable, and then how much you want to darken it. So here to darken something by 40%, I have my first box is purple, my second box is darkened by 40%. It pre-processes to this code, and then that's what I get. So that's pretty straightforward, and it might not seem that useful to you, but I'll give you an example of what you can do with this. Let's say you have a button on your site that you've designed. It has a background color with a darker border and then a lighter box shadow behind it. You can use CSS to do all the code for this button. You might have your starting color of the button at top, have that be the background color of the button, have the border be darkened by 20%, and the box shadow color be lightened by 20%. So it's pretty straightforward. You get a button, but the cool part about this then is, let's say you want to have a blue button. All you have to do is change that first color to the blue, and then you can use the same code and it automatically darkens and lightens the proper color. So if you know what you want your buttons to look like, If you have kind of the same, if you come up with a design that'll work like this in any color, you can just change the main color without having to recalculate the other colors yourself. You can also use SAS to saturate and desaturate colors. Remember, this is adding or subtracting gray from the color. So here we have some code. We're going to take a color, have the first box be our color. The second box, we're going to saturate the color by 70%. And that means make it 70% more pure and less gray. So it comes out to that CSS, and then we did this. So a blue box at the top, and then a more saturated blue at the bottom. So it has less gray in the bottom color. Desaturate does the opposite thing. I'm going to desaturate my blue by 70%, and here I get a blue that's much more gray in the second box. So those are just a couple things you can do with color in SAS, and there's actually a lot more. You know, I don't have time to tell you everything tonight, obviously. And they're all kind of very simple and straightforward things, but when you have a site with tons of colors on it and lots of things happening, if you're using SAS, you can look at this in 5 ways to make your life a lot simpler by not having to say the same color over and over and not having to do the same calculations if patterns are repeated. So going on to what the color looks like on your screen. And the question is, now that I've decided what colors I want and I know the numbers to use to put them on the screen, are they going to look the same on every screen? And the answer to that is no, they're not. And you know, if you've ever gone to a TV store, you know they have all these TVs on the wall, they're all playing the exact same program, the same things on the screen, but they all look just a little bit different. And that's because every device is going to show colors just a little differently. Because there's differences between manufacturers, between models, between even individual units in the same model of TV or computer or phone or whatever they are. Color, like TVs, for example, will change color over the years as they get older. Or even some devices will change color as the day goes by after they warm up. And these are maybe only slight differences, but it does mean that people aren't all going to see the same color that you're seeing. Remember I told you that when we have color, we're telling each subpixel of red, green, and blue how much intensity should display of that color. But RGB, it's not actually the color itself. RGB is more like a recipe that we tell to the device, and then the device chooses how to interpret that to display the color on the screen. So it's not always going to be exactly the same. Then the question is, well, what do you do about this if everybody's not seeing the same color? The first thing you should do is, when you're working, you calibrate your monitor to get it as close to normal as possible. So at least you're starting from normal when you're designing something. And the second thing to do is test on devices, on different types of devices, you know, and different brands of devices, and different types of screens that people might use, because they're all going to look just a tiny bit different. And colors that maybe look good together on your desktop monitor might look a little bit off on other screens, and you might need to tweak it a bit so it's going to still look good on every possible screen. And then light level also affects what people can see. The ambient light level in the room around them as they're looking at their screen is going to affect how the colors look. For example, somebody might be in bright sunlight, having the sunlight going right at their phone, and make it harder to see because everything's kind of washed out on the screen. Or you might be in a dark room looking at your phone, and it has like the auto brightness and it gets dimmer to accommodate being in a dark room, and that's going to change what the screen looks like to the person who's looking at it. You might be at a desktop computer in a room with fluorescent lights over your head, or you might be using a laptop outside under sunlight instead of fluorescent light. That's also going to affect the colors. So there's really nothing you can do about this either. People are going to have different devices, they're going to be in different lighting conditions, they're going to have their contrast turned down on their screen. So it's all going to look a little bit different. And again, you just need to get out there and test in different lighting levels and make sure there's enough contrast, you know, even if you're standing in the bright sun or whatever. And my suggestion is you go to the beach for a day to test things on your phone. That always works out really good. There is hope, though, coming up ahead. This is something that will be new in CSS4, so this is not actually in any browsers yet. It's something to think about in the future. You're actually going to be able to do media queries where it can query the light sensor in the device and tell you what the light level is in the room, is it dark or is it light in the room, and you can adjust your colors on your site then to account for that. So you might want to display different colors to somebody depending on whether they're in a dark room or in a very bright environment. And what the media query is, it's a media query, and then it's light level, and then the three responses are normal for normal light. Dim, if you're in a dark room, you don't want excessive contrast in the site. Or the third value is washed, which is you're in a very bright environment and everything's going to look washed out on the screen. So again, you can't do this yet, but it's something really interesting that's coming up in the future, and it allows you to change what people see. And you already know that apps do this. If you use, like, say, I think some of the maps apps on your phone, if you're using them at night or in a dark room, it'll have everything on black background instead of a white background. Some sites do that. Websites tend to just do that by the time. The apps can actually use the light sensor on your phone and actually determine whether you're in a dark or light room. And it's kind of funny, but I was using maps recently, and I was outside, and I went into a tunnel, and it like switched from white to dark, and then switched when I came out of the tunnel. I just thought that was kind of interesting. So apps can do this, but we can't do this on websites yet. The other thing to think about where you might want to adjust the color on your site is for printers, which may or may not have a cat on the top of them, I don't know. But what people print out, you might want that to look different than what people see on the screen. So try printing out your site, which you should do anyways, because you might need to adjust the layout and things like that for printing. But also adjust the colors, because the colors that look good on the screen might look weird on paper, or you might want to have less colors or different contrast or something like that. So always check the colors when you print something out, and then of course you're going to just do a print style sheet, which is pretty straightforward to change the styles that you give the site for when you're printing it. And then the last thing with color is the context of where the colors are and what people see on the screen. Perception, individuals' perception of what they see is important. What they think they see is not necessarily what somebody else thinks they see. And a pretty recent example of this, obviously, the dress. Everybody's seen this, right? So a lot of people thought this was gold and white, and then some people thought it was blue and black, and everybody fought over it for like a good part of the day on the internet, and some people got in fist fights even. I think it was pretty crazy. So the dress is actually blue and black. It's just in a photo that's very overexposed with poor light balance. And some people can look at this and see that it's supposed to be blue and black when it's not actually blue and black if you look at the individual colors. Like if you look at that top part, it actually is a gold color if you just focus down on those individual pixels. But some people are able to correctly interpret that the colors are blue and black even though that's not what's actually on the screen, or other people can't. So another example is, this is kind of an optical illusion here. So what I see when I look at this, there's pink swirls and then there's green and blue swirls. Is that what everybody sees, pink, blue, and green swirls? Yes? So that's actually not what it is though. When you look at it, if you take part of a blue swirl and part of one of the green swirls, and then you magnify them, it's the exact same color. What you see as a blue swirl and a green swirl are actually that kind of bluish green in there. But by having these different, the way the oranges and the pinks interact with them, it makes your eyes think that they're different colors of blue and green, which is, I think, is kind of crazy that you can, even after knowing that, you look at it and you still see green and blue. So that's just something to think about, is when you're choosing colors, that might not be what people are actually seeing. And sometimes you have to change colors to make them look different than, you have to change colors. When you look at something, the colors that you're trying to get might not be actually, sorry, my brain just stopped working for a second. You might have the same color in something, but it might look different even though it's actually the same color. So for example, here I have some text, I have a headline and text below it. And they're actually all the same color, but it's a little hard to see on the screen, but the headline looks darker than the text below it because the strokes of the text are thicker on the large letters. You actually need to make the text below it a little bit darker than the headline to make them look like the same color on the screen. So instead of just having them the same color, you make it just a slightly darker color for the text. Because otherwise you look at it and it looks like the paragraph is lighter text because of lighter strokes. So this is just a little trick. You actually have to make things different colors to make them look like the same color. Screen size actually influences perception too. You need less colors and less contrast on a small screen. This is actually, you know, a really good concept that people should use on websites, but I had trouble finding examples of it because nobody's doing this. But I found one good example, kind of an average example, of a Twitter site from a couple years ago. So this is the desktop large screen view of it, and there's a lot of colors and a lot of things going on here. And you see they have the 6 different colors for the different links in the middle. Then on the small screen, instead of having the colors for the links, they're just white with a color next to it. And the reason for that is because there's a smaller screen, your eyes are looking at a lot less things on that screen at once. So instead of those 4 links needing to stand out amongst everything else, they don't need to stand out as much because they're there below the other thing. So you can get rid of all that color, because that would look too much of those 6 links where all those different colors there. When you're on a screen where most of it's going to be white, that's just going to look kind of silly. As opposed to it looked, you know, it just stood out, it looked good in the midst of all those pictures. So this is how you might use a meaning query to just change the color of links to have less color on a smaller screen. Because you don't need as many colors, you don't need as much visual differentiation between things. So that's something to think about. So that is actually all I have for color. So maybe I can take a couple questions on color and then I'll move on to the typography part. Does anybody have a question? No? Did that all make sense? Is anybody asleep? Everybody poke your neighbor, make sure they're awake. Okay, so the other thing I'm going to talk about is typography. In typography, a lot of what we do in typography has to do with user experience, because when you're looking at typography on a website, it's the method by which we're communicating with people. And our typography, the goal is to make our message easier for people to understand. Typography, it isn't just decoration of the site. I mean, your whole site isn't just decoration. And a lot of people think of it that way. They design a site, they're like, I'm going to make it look really great. It's going to be beautiful and look nice and be compelling, and people look and they'll go, oh, that site looks so nice. But that's not what a website is for. Websites aren't for looking nice. They're for communicating a message or allowing people to interact with the site and perform transactions. So if you're not doing what you need to do with the typography and making the site easy to use, you just kind of miss the whole point of web design. You never want to make the design stand in the way of the message, which a lot of sites actually do. You know, they're like, oh, we need to use this typeface and make it this big. But then you look at it and you can't read anything. And, you know, if you can't get the message, if you can't read it, you'll leave the site and go somewhere else. So there's 3 qualities of type that work together to make text look good and easy to read. Font size, line height, and line length. I'm going to talk about each of these and then what you should do with each of them on a responsive website to make your type easy to read. So the first, I'm actually going to show you a little screenshot first. This is Trent Walton's website. He's a web designer. And this is going to show how all those 3 things work together on a website. As I go from narrow to widescreen view, you can see that this height got a lot larger, that the margins changed, that everything on the screen changed. When you have a large screen, you want to make everything bigger to take advantage of all that space that you have. Whereas on a small screen, you don't have a lot of space, so you want to, make sure you're using the space wisely. You don't make things bigger than they need to be. So he's using media queries to make the size of the type and everything else change for the different screen sizes. So font size, that's the first of these 3 things that we need to talk about. And traditionally we've used fixed font sizes on websites, like pixels or something like that, where the type is always going to be the same size. But there's actually different units that we're going to use that are relative units, which are M's and Rems. And they work a little bit differently in that they're relative to each other, and they're relative to a starting point, rather than being the exact same size no matter what the situation. The reason why they're called M's is that when they did metal typesetting back in the day, they determined the size of a typeface or the size of a font by the width of the letter M, because that was the largest letter in the alphabet, the capital M. And a lot of people think this actually transfers to digital design, but other than the name, the M, which comes from that, it doesn't. Here I have M's in 4 different typefaces, which are the same font size. And you can tell when I do a box of 1 M width around them, 1 M is always the same, no matter what typeface we're using. So M's are not dependent on the typeface, these, they're only dependent on the size of the font. So if you're styling, if you're setting your font size in M, it's pretty simple. You start with 1 M as your default, and then 2 M's, you would just use that if you want to make something twice as big. 0.5 M's, make something half as big. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple math. Your CSS would look like this. Maybe you'd have an H1 with a font size of 3 M's, down to a paragraph with a font size of 1 M, so your H1 would be 3 times the size of your paragraph. Pretty straightforward. Since you're starting with 1 M, you don't need to set the font size again for your paragraph. You can just leave that out. So this was what it comes out. The H1 is 3 M's, 3 times as big as the paragraph, which are the default font size. The tricky thing about M's, they can be confusing because they're actually based on the size of the containing element, not just a starting point of 1 M. So if you have elements nested within other elements and set the font size for them, they actually multiply against each other. So, for example, here you have a paragraph, you have a div, then you have a span inside the div. The div is a font size of 2 M, the span is a font size of 1.5 M. So it sounds like the span should be smaller than the div, but since the span is inside the div, the 1.5 M actually multiplies against the 2 M, so it's actually 3 M is how big your span ends up being. And that sounds a little bit complicated, but when you're doing CSS, you need to just be thoughtful about how you write your CSS, which you should do anyways. Just make your CSS as straightforward as you can, as simple as you can. Apply styles the least amount of times as you can to get the result you're trying to get. So you're not going to apply font size to every single thing everywhere. You're going to start out with a base font size and then just apply font sizes only to elements where you need to change them from that size. And if you do that and think about what you're doing, you won't have very many conflicts. But if you are using M's, it's really nice because you can have everything in a container change font size all at once and still maintain a scale. So for example, here I have inside a div, I have headline and text, and I made the headline in a good proportion to the text. If I change the font size for the whole div and make it bigger, you see that it changes the size of the headline and the paragraph text and makes them bigger all at once, but they're still in proportion to each other. So it makes it kind of easy if you want to say make everything inside your sidebar a little bit smaller, or everything inside a call-out box bigger. You can just do it all at once with the M's and it'll multiply by whatever font size you already set for that element. Excuse me. So the way to set your font size to start out is you set a font size with percentage on your body of 100%. And this is the only time you use percent instead of M's or Rems is on your starting point. And you're wondering, like, how big is this? Because I told you, 1 M is your base font size. You're starting with 100%. And you're like, what does that mean? So it actually, for most devices, works out to 16 pixels, like on your desktop computer and on a lot of phones. But not every device, because what 1 M means is that is telling the device, it's not saying make it a certain size, it's saying figure out for this device what is the best reading size and make it that size. So there's some devices, like some e-readers, where if you say 1 M, it actually works out to 20 pixels because of the way the screen is. It needs to be bigger on that screen in pixels to be a good reading size. And as we go forward with different device types, this actually gets more and more important because 1 M is going to end up being very different sizes on different devices. But no matter what the device is or type of device, whatever Apple comes up with next year, if you say 1 M, you can be assured that is going to be a good reading size on every single device, even though it won't be the same size. So I said on desktop computers, 1 M works out to about 16 pixels, just so you have an idea of how big that is. And that might seem pretty big to you because we're used to doing websites where text is 10 or 12 pixels, which is a lot smaller. And lately, a lot of sites have started doing this, starting with 1 M, so everything is 16 pixels or bigger. And it actually can look pretty big on the screen, and people complain about this all the time. They're like, your type is too big. It's like, well, why is that something anybody would bother to complain about? I have no idea, but people do. People just need to complain, I guess. So it's controversial, but the thing is, not everybody has great eyesight. And we're designing for everybody. We're not just about designing for people with good eyesight. And especially older people. Once you get to be about 40, your near vision starts to deteriorate. It does that for everybody. That's just a fact of life. So with older people, you go in an office where everybody's working on a computer, you'll see a lot of the older people like leaning forward and squinting at their screen because everything's too small. You know, and I'm about 40, so that's been happening to me. I find things are too small on websites, and I'm starting to have trouble seeing things. So if you're young, if you're a young designer, you're not thinking about that, because you still have great vision, and you're like, I'll make the text really tiny, I can read it, and it just doesn't occur to you that not everybody can read it. So for those of you who are young, I'm explaining this to you now, that not everybody can see as well as you do. It's just a fact of life, it'll happen to you too. But think about all these older people that are coming to your site, and you want to make the text big enough so they can read it. What?
She asked me if that was true. I'm young and naive.
Well, you know,
Making a joke that I was old.
well, I'm sure you're not that old. I mean, that's the thing. If you're young, maybe nobody has ever told you this. You might not know that people's vision deteriorates. You know, you see people wearing glasses, you're like, oh, some people just need glasses. But it's not that. It's this thing that for everybody, their vision deteriorates. And once you're aware of that, that's going to change how you design it. Because that's like one of the most important usability things is the text big enough to read on a website. If you go to a site and you can't read the text, you're going to go away. You know, you're going to lose a lot of people that if they can't see the text. So if you're using that one ad, which is pretty big maybe because of what you're used to, if it looks too big on your page, the issue with that is scale. That means if something is big, everything else needs to be big too. So if your text is larger, the other things need to be larger on your page. Your headlines need to be larger. Your header might need to be larger. The images may need to be larger. Because you can't just make the text bigger and have everything else small. It's going to look wrong. So make sure everything is in good scale to each other. And that just means, you know, for these examples, on a small website, there's a lot less white space. But when you go to the bigger page, you know, you can see there's a lot more white space and everything else is getting bigger on the page. You know, you want to take advantage of that space. When you have a big screen, make everything big, make everything spread out. And that's kind of one of the really cool things about responsive design is your design doesn't need to feel the same for each side of the screen. It's going to feel different on smaller screens than larger screens. You still need to have the text big enough to read no matter what the size of the screen, but once you're designing for this other version of the site that's a bigger screen, take advantage of that space, make everything bigger, and make it, you know, feel more spacious. So I told you what M's, and REMs are, they work almost the same for sizing text. They're called REMs. The R stands for root, which is the root of the HTML document. And they work a little bit differently in that there's not this nesting issue I told you about. It always goes back to the root when it figures out the size. So if you have something inside another element, it doesn't multiply. It just goes back to that one M that you're starting with. So again, you're starting with the font size in percentage on the HTML element. So this sounds easier, right? But there's a problem, and that's that it's not supported on every browser. So if you use REMs, you have to use a fallback to make sure that other browsers can display your site. So the issues particularly with size IE8 and older and upper mid that don't support REMs. So there's two things you can do to accommodate them. And the first thing you can do, if you have to support IE8 and older or all browsers, you need to do a fallback font size in pixels. And all you have to do is put the pixels first before the REMs, because the way that CSS works, if you remember, they look at the first thing, it'll say, okay, 32 pixels, got it. They look at the one after that, font size 2 REMs, it'll either say, oh, REMs, I'm going to do this instead of what came before it, or it's going to say, I don't know what REMs are, I'm going to ignore this, but I already got the pixels. So if it can't do REMs, it'll do the pixels. Pretty straightforward, except a lot of work. You have to go through your whole website and put in pixels for everything. You can figure out the number just by multiplying by 16. You know, it's fine. It's not complicated, but a lot of work. If you don't want to support older browsers like IE8 and older, you don't have to do all this work necessarily, but you do have to do something. Because even if you're not supporting those browsers, you don't want people to go to your website in IE8, those few people, maybe they are, but get something where all the font is the exact same size. That would be really bad, because it's hard to navigate through a site if you can't tell where the headers are or what the different parts of the sites are by the size of the text. So there's a simple fallback you can use. And that's just don't set any font sizes at all. So if you know the way HTML works, everything has its own default. If you use no CSS at all, the browser will take H1 and make it really big and make the headings in sizes going downward in paragraph and a readable size. So the browser already knows to do that. So if you just have that available as your fallback, at least the headers will be bigger than the paragraphs, et cetera. So say it'll be readable on 98. But the problem is, if you're doing a CSS reset on your site, you can screw this up. You might have a reset where you set everything to 0 or everything to the same size, all the margins to 0. A lot of people use like normalize or Eric Meyer's reset. If you're doing that, you need to make sure that you are not, that you are only setting the 100% on the HTML and that you are not setting font sizes for anything else except in rems. So if all you have is at 100% to start, then the browser will know to do this HTML default. But if you're setting any font sizes to 1 or to like a baseline, it's going to cancel that out and make everything the same size. So even if you're not actively supporting 98, go back if you're using rems and make sure that your font sizes actually look reasonable or readable in 98. So line height is the next of the 3 qualities to think about. And line height can be called leading in typographic terms, and the reason for that is when they did metal typesetting, they had these pieces of lead that went between the rows of type to determine how much space is between them. So if you hear leading, that's where the word comes from. Line height is really important for legibility because it determines, as you're reading, whether your eyes can travel easily from one line to the next. This is the line height of 1, and if you've ever used like a regular typewriter, this is like single spacing. A line height of 2, it's like double spacing on the typewriter, so the space between the lines is the same height as the size of the text. And then this is what it looks like. So the top, that's a line height of 1, so the space around the text, there's no extra space. On the bottom is a line height of 2, so the space around the text is like the same as the space of the text, divided from the top to the bottom. So if you look at the size of the text, the size of the whole thing, including the space, is twice what the size of the text is. So a line height of 1, like this, the lines are pretty close together. And that's hard to read because what happens, your eyes are going along, they go from the end of one line to the beginning of the next line. It's hard for your eyes to figure out where the start of the next line is. So it takes like a fraction of a second, but as you go from that last word to the next word, your eyes have to pause and your brain does a little extra work to find the right line. So it's going to be slower to read this because the lines are too close together. You have kind of the same problem if the lines are too far apart. Again, your brain and your eyes have trouble going from the end of one line to the beginning of the next line because they can't tell exactly where that next line is. It's a little too far away. So a good compromise is somewhere in between. They've actually done studies on this. You don't need to guess. They've done studies to figure out the best number for this. And it's a line height of 1.4. So 1.4, they've shown that makes the text easiest to read. So it might vary a little bit depending on typeface or line length or other things like that. But in general, even if you're not a visual designer, you know that you can do a line height of 1.4 and it's going to look pretty good and pretty readable on your screen no matter what. When you do line height, you don't need units on it. This is actually the only thing in CSS where you don't need to use any units at all. So it's just a line height of 1.3 is like 30% more than a line height of 1. It's pretty straightforward. You might want to sometimes do mean queries and put more line height if you have a wider screen. On a small screen, the lines can be a little closer together because, there's less text on the screen and it's easier to get from one line to the next. So you might want to start with a line height of 1.3 on small screens. Use a media query to go up to 1.4 on, maybe a tablet-sized screen or 1.5 on a desktop-sized screen. I'm being kind of arbitrary here with the numbers, but this is just something you might want to do is start out with 1.4 and see if you need to adjust from in one direction or the other depending on your screen size. So when you're doing the line height, you also want to think about your vertical margins, the space between one paragraph to the next. And this needs to be proportional to your line height. On the top, you have a line height of 1, and you also want to have a space that's 1 line high between the paragraphs. On the bottom, you have a line height of 1.5, and we want the space between the paragraphs to be 1.5 lines high. So it's pretty straightforward. You're going to use the same number. To make it look right, you're going to use the same number and just do the margins and ends instead of having no units like on the line height. So your line height is 1.5, you're going to do your margin top and bottom on the paragraph to 1.5 ends. So that'll make the text look balanced. You know, and of course you can put different numbers in there, but if it's too far apart or too close together, you're going to look at the text, it's just going to look wrong. So the third thing we're going to talk about is line length, which is how many characters are in each line, and this is called measure in typographic terms. You know, obviously, really long lines like this are hard to read. You know, that's pretty basic, because this is the whole reason when we started doing websites, we put them in columns, because you don't want to read text that goes all the way across the screen. It's too hard to read. Short lines of text are hard to read too. The long lines, you have the same problem, your eyes having trouble getting from one line to the next. Short lines, it's easy to get from one line to the next, but because your eyes have to go back and forth so often, it's more tiring to read this text when the lines are too short. So again, they've done studies, they figured this out and determined it's 45 to 75 characters is the best range to have your lines in to make them easy to read. And you know, it depends on other factors like how much text is on the screen or typeface. But 45 to 75 characters is a really good starting place to make your text easy to read. And when I'm talking about all these different things, I'm referring to body text, like your paragraphs of text. Obviously, your headlines or things in your navigation might be different lengths or different sizes. You know, but we're talking about the big chunks of text that people are reading. Obviously, it's going to vary per line. There's a different, you know, the line stops at the end of a word and it's spread out. It's not always going to be the same amount of characters. You're just going for an average. The typeface is going to have a really big impact on this. I have a bunch of different typefaces here in the exact same font size. You can tell that a line of the same characters is a much different length depending on what typeface you're using. So you want to decide your typeface before you start laying out the site, because otherwise, if you work out good line lengths for every line and make everything work really well, if you change the typeface, it might throw off all your numbers, and then you just kind of wasted all that work. So it's important to do the typeface first. If you need to figure out, as you're developing, you're going to need to figure out how many characters are in each line. You don't want to count them every single time. So there's a couple ways to do it. This is a really great bookmarklet that Chris Coyer made. And it's just install the bookmarklet in your browser, and then you can click on any element on any page, and it will count the characters for you. So this is how it works. You click on your bookmarklet, and then you select any element here and click on it. And it's going to highlight the 45th to 75th character. So you can see here, I think you should be able to see on the screen that red bit in the middle paragraph there. So the line should end somewhere in that red there, because that's 45 to 75 characters. So the line here is much longer than 75 characters, so it's too long. As you're working on a site and testing it, you probably don't want to do a bookmarklet over and over again. So something else you can do is just count your text in your first paragraph once to 45 and 75 and put a span around it and color it red. And that way on your test page, you know, not a live page obviously, but as you're working on a test page, every time you reload it, and as you're testing at different screen sizes, you can double check that the red is falling within the end of the line. So I'm going to show you, again, the same site we looked at earlier, Trent Walton's website. And now that I told you, you know, the things that you can do with the line height and the font size and the length of the lines, you can see what he does on his site. He's using media queries, and kind of the key thing here is he's making sure no matter what the width of the site, it's always within the 45 to 75 characters. So you can tell, the lines look about the same length no matter what. But the font size gets bigger to fill up the page, and the margins get wider to make sure that line stays within that correct number of characters. So I've been talking about media queries and changing the font size or the line height or different things on your screen depending on the width of the screen. And when you're doing media queries, something important to remember is you can have as many media queries as you want, and they can be anywhere that you want, as long as it's where it makes sense. A lot of people think, oh, I have two media queries. I have a media query for tablets and a media query for desktops, and that's it. But that's not the correct way to do responsive websites, because you're not designing for only 3 screens. Not everybody uses a screen that is one of 3 exact sizes, like iPhone and iPad or desktop. You know, I mean, maybe you and your friends all use the same phone, but the thing is, there's a lot of different phones out there and a lot of different tablets. So really there's a screen on every size from like here to here. And your site needs to look good at all of those sizes, not just here, here, and here. So really you want to have as many queries as you want to have. You have tons of them. And especially when it comes to typography, you want to be thinking about where is the best place to put a media query to make what's on the screen look good. And that might not match up with where your other media queries are. You might have media queries to change the number of columns or change the navigation in certain places, and you can put your typography media queries in different places. But the thing to do is to start out with a certain size, change the size of the screen, and say, hey, this is a point at which it doesn't look good anymore. I need to put a media query here to make it look good at this screen size. And then keep testing on different screen sizes and change, as many things as you need to make it look good at every single screen size, not just at iPad and iPhone and desktop size. So I'm going to do a test page to show you kind of how to put these things together. So here I have just, a simple piece of text. I have the red in there to show the 45th to the 75th character, and it starts with the last word on the first line. So I'm at about 50 characters on this first line here. And this is an iPhone size screen. And this is 1M size type. So if you're starting with your default font size and an iPhone size screen, you're going to be within the 45 to 75 characters. So that's really good. You're already starting at a good point. There are screens narrower than the iPhone, of course. And you need to think about that, but sometimes you just can't get everything to fit. If the screen's narrower and your type is 1M, there might be less than 45 characters on each line. So it's kind of like a trade-off. It's like, well, do I need to make the type a little bit smaller to make the lines the right length, And you just got to look at it and figure out what's the best thing to do. Generally, you want to think about font size as your most important thing and then go from there. So for a smaller screen, your lines might be too short, but that's okay because the text is big enough to read. It's kind of, you got to make a trade-off. So we're going to start here. I'm going to have a line height of 1.3, a little less than the default to start out. And then I'm going to put some margins in there. I have a width of 94%, which means there's a 3% margin on each side. This is pretty important. When you're doing a small size screen, no matter how little space you have, you always need a margin on the left and the right. You never want the text to go and touch the edges of the screen because that's going to make it difficult to read. So always put that margin in there. You can have other things like images touch the edge, but text should never touch the edge of the screen or touch another edge like a border or something like that. There always needs to be white space around the text. So that was my starting point. I'm starting mobile first, small screen first. I make the screen wide, and then I get this. Obviously, my lines are really, really super long, and this is bad. So I need to add some media queries to fix this. And the first thing I'm going to do, and this is like a really, really powerful thing in responsive design called max width. And that just says that something shouldn't get bigger than a certain width. And you already use this for images, right? To make sure images aren't wider than their containing elements. You're going to do this for text to make sure the lines never get longer than 75 characters wide. So to do this, I start out with my most narrow screen. I make my browser window a little bit wider until it's 75 characters long. So it goes about to this. The red goes to the end of the line. And then what I'm going to do is figure out how wide the text is in M's and put my max width there. So once I add a speedy query, it's never going to get wider than that 28 M's. And you kind of just have to do some guesswork to get that number to be right. It's usually around 28 to 30 or so. It's going to depend on your typeface, but just try something in there until you see that it stops right at the end of the red text at 75 characters. So once I put that max width in there, if I make the browser window wider, or the screen wider, my text is not going to get any wider than 75 characters. So obviously this is pretty simple, just one column on a page, and it's more complicated when you have things in multiple columns and are piecing things together. But if you do this, at least you know no matter what else is happening on the screen, your text is not going to get too wide. And this is max width, so it still can get narrower if it needs to fit inside something, but it'll never be too wide. So now we don't want to waste all that empty space once I made the screen really wide, so we're going to add some more media queries. So we're going to go back. It was good on the small screen. It was good a little bit wider until it got to the 75 characters here. And what I do is I keep making the screen a little bit wider, and I say, this is the point at which there's too much white space on the screen. So I want to do something to fill up more of the screen. So I'm going to add a media query. So I'm going to have a media query, and this I'm just doing arbitrary numbers here. It's totally going to depend what is actually on your screen. So I have this is 48 ems wide is where the screen is right now. So I have a media query. When the screen is 48 ems wide or wider, I'm going to increase the font size from 1 to 1.1, increase the line height from 1.3 to 1.4. So what happens, I make the screen a little bit wider, and you can see the text got bigger and the line height got bigger. So now the text got wider and there's less white space around it. So by adding that media query, now I'm taking better use of all that space on the screen, and there's not so much white space. So if you want to figure out where to put that media query, I've been making my browser window wider and narrower. All you need to do is have a tool like mqtest.io open in a different tab in the same browser window. So once I've changed the size of the window, I just switch this tab. This tool tells me exactly how wide the browser window is at that point. So it's 30.8125 ems is how wide the window is. So now I know if this is the point at which I want something to happen, that's the window size I need to use in the media query. And you can round it off, especially when you're doing typography. Remember, everything doesn't need to be exact, and your eyes can't even tell the difference between like tiny increments of things. So you don't need 30.8125, you can just round that to 30. So I can keep going from there. Again, I want to make it wider until there's too much white space, and now I can add another media query to make the text bigger again. So you can just keep doing that. When you're starting from a small screen, just figure out at what point you have too much white space, or the text looks too small, or things just they feel like they need to be bigger, and that's the point at which you add a media query and change what the text looks like, to make it wider, or to make it larger, to have it take up more space on the screen. Sometimes you're stuck with text like this when there's really long lines, like you have an existing design. You can't change this, you can't make the lines less characters. This is like 100 probably long or so. The lines are too long. But a trick you can do, if your lines are too long, make the line height a little bit taller, and that'll make it easier to read. So this is an easy trick, line height. If you have an existing site, changing the line height isn't going to screw anything else up. So you might as well do this and make the text a little bit easier for you. So alignment and hyphenation come in when you're doing typography and can make things look better on the screen. Hyphenation is a newer property in CSS. So this is what justified text looks like. And if you're doing a Word doc or something like that, you've probably used this. If you look in a book, this is what the text looks like. And it looks very neat and even on each side of the screen. But if you compare it to this, the second example, that's left-aligned text. And the difference is, on the justified text, you can see there's gaps in the middle of the line because it needs to space out all the text on a line. And since these are short lines, there's not enough words to make it space out well. In a book, there's longer lines, so it spaces out well. Here, there's not enough words, so it looks, there's these empty spaces. So the left-aligned text just looks better when you have short lines like this. So you don't ever want to use justified text on a website if you can avoid it, especially when you have short lines, because you're going to get these little gaps in between words that are going to look funny. But if you compare it at the end, the third one, we have hyphenated text. And what happens here, you can see in the left-aligned text, the second example, we got rid of the space in the middle of the line, but there's some empty spaces at the end of the line. But you can tell in the third example, with hyphenation, it evens out the right side, the right margin. So hyphenation, it just makes things look a little bit neater. It doesn't necessarily help with readability, but it makes, the overall visual effect look good. Hyphenation, it's new in CSS and is not available in all the browsers. And you do need to use prefixes to get it to work in WebKit and Mozilla. It's not available in all browsers, and you might think, well, that's a problem. I want something to work everywhere. But this is an example of progressive enhancement, which is a really important term in web design. What that means is you want to start with a design that works on every device, and then build on that and add little extras where they'll work on other devices, but not in a way that means that the older devices aren't going to get the full experience of the site. So somebody, if they have an older browser without hyphenation, they're not missing out on anything. They're not missing content or anything like that. They just have like a little bit of ragged edge on their lines. But by adding this for the browsers that can get it, you're just making it look a little bit nicer for those browsers. Sometimes we'll just want to have hyphenation on shorter line screens. Like I showed you on the shorter lines, there's not enough words to make things space out properly. But if you have a much wider screen, it's easier for things to space out, so you might not need the hyphenation. So you might want to use a media query. For example, here I only have hyphenation if the screen is 40 ems or narrower. When you're doing hyphenation, you need to set the language for the page. And that's telling it if it's English or French or something else. You do that usually in the HTML element like this, which is something you should do anyways. It's important for search engines and things like that to know what your site is about, what language it's in. If you don't set the language element, your hyphenation won't work at all. Because obviously if the browser doesn't know if it's English or French or Spanish, it's not going to know what dictionary to look at to figure out where the hyphens should go in the words. So if you can't get your hyphenation to work and you know you're using the correct browser, it might be because you forgot the language element. Only a little bit left, so hopefully you're all still awake. Typeface is also something to think about in responsive design. And then the same typeface might not work for every screen size. Here's an example of a site. They have this kind of unusual font that they use for their slogan, a big paragraph out there. It looks decent enough on a desktop screen. You know, it's kind of hard to read because it's all caps. But if you look at the same site on a small screen, using the exact same typeface, the problem is their whole slogan doesn't even fit on the screen at once. So when you go to the site for the first time, that's what you get. So to me, they're not really presenting this great first impression on the small screen. You're just getting half the slogan. So I would want to make it so at least you can read the slogan all at once on the small screen. But the problem is with this unusual typeface they're using, first, it only comes in uppercase. You can't do lowercase with it. And second, it can't really get smaller than that because it kind of looks weird at smaller sizes. It's difficult to read. This is kind of a trade-off. What you might want to do is use a totally different typeface for the smaller screen. If you're really set that you have to use this on the desktop screen, but on the small screen, you're trading off readability here. So you might want to, your branding person from the company might not agree with this, but you might want to talk them into it and say this needs to be readable. We just need to use a different typeface on the small screen. We need to use something that we can make smaller so it'll fit the whole slogan on there. And maybe even have something that's with upper and lowercase so it's easier to read. So you can just do a media query here. Just start out with, your font family for a small screen in Helvetica or something like that is going to be easy to read. And then have a media query and say if the screen is 30 ems or wider, then I'm going to use Popular, which is their typeface, and have it in uppercase letters. So that's an example of where typeface that looks good on one screen size might not look good on another one. So when it comes to responsive design, a lot of times we want to be talking about performance. And really performance is an issue for every kind of website, whether it's responsive or not, whether people are on a small screen or large screen. Because the longer a site takes to load, they're going to give up and go away and go to another site. And this is getting more and more important because people want things to load fast. And as people are making sites now, they're making images bigger, they're putting more elements on the page and just making it longer to load. So what we want to do with performance for typography, the issue we have is with web fonts. And web fonts are great. Remember a few years back, before web fonts came along, we could only use the typefaces that were on the computer, like Helvetica and Arial and Times New Roman. And now we can use any typeface, which is great. But every time we use a new typeface on our website, it has to be downloaded. It's not on the device anymore, so it's coming from somewhere. And those add up. And this is the way that web fonts work. You start out by declaring a font family, by naming it, and then saying where the files are that you're downloading. You have to have multiple files so it has the correct one for every device. And then say if it's a normal or bold or something like that. So the first thing we want to think about is, can I use fewer fonts? I don't want to have to download 20 different font files on the same site. That would be just ridiculous and silly. That's a lot of downloading when you don't need 20 fonts on a site. To start with, you can get by with 2 or 3 on nearly every site. And if you need to have more differentiation, say between your text and your headings and different parts of the site, you can do that, with color or with bold or something like that to make type look different. It doesn't need to be by having a different typeface everywhere. Because if you have all sorts of different typefaces, it's just going to look weird for one thing. You want the typefaces to look good together. So what you can do, even on small screens, is to download even less fonts on a small screen than you do on a large screen. And that way, for people with mobile phones who are more likely to have a slow connection, you're saving them things to download. And you can do this with a media query. And the really cool thing about fonts is if it's not being used on the page, it won't be downloaded. And this is different than images. If you have different images on a page, but they're inside media queries, it downloads all of them anyways, which is the issue. But with fonts, it only downloads it when it needs it. So if you put your font inside a media query and say, I only want to use Source Sans Pro if my screen is 30 ms or wider, those narrow screens aren't even going to download it at all. They're just going to use what you originally declared, which was Arial, which is already on the device and it doesn't need to download. So that's just something, it's not a big impact on performance, but it is, at least a little impact of one extra thing that you can say to make sites faster on the small screens. But again, people that might be on a laptop in a hotel room or something like that too, where they have a slow connection. So your best bet is trying to make things as fast as possible for every screen size. So if you're using system fonts on a small screen, so you don't have to download as many typefaces, it's a little extra work. You have to figure out what's available on that screen. And this goes back, it's kind of similar, remember I said back in the old days we had to determine what was already on the system, like Helvetica or Times New Roman. And it's the same thing if you want to do system fonts for your mobile devices and small screens. There's a site, TinyType, and the URL is in the slides when I give you that later, and you can go and see exactly which typefaces are available in iOS and Android and Windows and BlackBerry. So you need to make sure your font stack includes one for each of those devices. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of overlap. There's like none on iOS that are also on Android, so you have to have at least one for each of the different devices. So, but remember, you can have as many fonts in your font stack as you want, and it'll just use the first one it comes to that it has. So here, maybe we say Helvetica, which iOS has, Arial, Droid Sans is on Android, and then now we end with Serif or Sans Serif or whatever. So if it doesn't find any of the fonts you listed, at least can use the default. So that's, kind of something to think about when you're doing for typography on websites is what you can do to make sure you're not having a bad impact on performance. So it comes back to communication, which is what I started with. All those things I talked about, our goal here is not just to make the website look good, but to make the text as easy to read as possible. So that's something you should think about all the time as you're going through the site is, am I doing things in the design that are making the site easy to read so I can get the message across so that people can do their transactions. And you have to make sure that your design is promoting this communication instead of getting in the way. So that is all I have. So thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, I can take questions, I think, probably for a few minutes. Any questions? No? So I have some books to give away. So if anybody has a question, I might be able to give them a book.
I had a question. So working with typography in the past, I was going to use kerning. What would be a good solution to use kerning in typography today? For what?
So the question, I'll repeat it in case everybody didn't hear. So she's asking about using kerning in typography on the web. And that is, generally you don't need to do a lot of that with web type because if you're using a good typeface, a good font, it's going to look good without having to do a lot of kerning. I say a good typeface, and that actually makes a difference. If you go out there, there's millions of free fonts on the web. And, it's nice that things are free, but if they're free, it means that whoever made it might not have put a lot of work into it. And it might have some fancy letters, but when you put it on the screen, they don't fit well together, or there's too much space between them, or not enough space, or something like that. So that's when you have a problem. But if you're using a good typeface, that you paid for a web font or something like that, or even a lot of the ones like on Google web fonts are free. If it's a good typeface, you don't really have to worry about kerning for reading text.
I thought I heard you say this, but I just wanted to
design for mobile first? Is that the best way to do it? And the answer is yes. And I don't call it mobile first, I call it small screen first. It's kind of a little bit different. Mobile first is an idea that Luke Robuski came up with. He wrote a book about it. And it's the idea of designing for a phone, the way people interact with a phone. So it's not just small screen, but the way people interact, like if they're using their fingers instead of a mouse. So it's kind of a different mindset. But in responsive design, I kind of look at it differently, that I'm just designing for small screen. I'm not thinking of it particularly as a mobile, as a touch screen, but just the small screen I'm starting with as the design and then going to a wider design. And the reason why that works better, I like to explain it like this. If you've ever moved, let's say, you're living in a small apartment and you need to move to a big house. It's great because you have your stuff. There's plenty of room for it in the big house. You can find places for everything. Your furniture all fits. But if you try moving from a big house to a small apartment, not everything fits. You have boxes still packed in the hallway, and your sofa doesn't actually fit through the door into the living room, and it's hard. It's hard to get a lot of stuff into a small space when you start in a big space. And it's the same thing with responsive design. If you start with the wide screen first, you're like, okay, I got everything on the screen, it looks great on the desktop. How do I squish it down? It's like trying to move into that small apartment. It's really hard to squish everything down and make it fit. But if you start with the small screen first, this is what looks good on the small screen. Maybe there's less things on there because I figured out I don't need everything. I made it all fit. Then when you make the screen wider, wow, there's plenty of space. Everything still fits. I can move it around, make things bigger. It just works a lot better. I can't even imagine to try taking a big design and squishing it down. That just seems so counterintuitive and difficult. There's situations you might have to do that, like if you're working with an existing design on a desktop site and changing it to a responsive site, you might have to start with that wide screen. But if you're doing a brand new design from scratch, it is a million times easier to start with that small screen first and make it go wider. So the two people that asked questions, I have books for you, and then the third book I'm giving away, the person who volunteered to sit in the front row first, the guy in the green sweatshirt here, because everybody else was back there and he got started to give them a book. So, any more questions, or people want to go? Okay. Well, I have somebody else who had the next one again.
You were talking about the media query. What else can you check? What else can websites check? Like maybe bandwidth or something like that? Or?
So what can you check with a media query? The most common thing, and what we started to do with media queries, is the width of the screen, or the width of the browser window, actually. And that's what we think of when we think of responsive design, is getting everything to fit in the width of the window. You can actually query some other things. Some of them are available in browsers and some of them aren't yet. And you can query the height of the window, so that's less common, but you might want to think somebody might have like a long screen, like on a widescreen desktop monitor, or you might have a tall screen like on a phone. So that's something to think about. You can query the height of the screen and see, how do I get everything to fit near the top or something like that. You can query the type of screen, like there's TVs, like you can view the web on TVs or game consoles. I think that's not supported widely yet. There's some other things that aren't supported. You asked about querying bandwidth. That is not something you can do by media query. You can kind of query bandwidth on the server side, but it's not very accurate. They haven't really come up with a good way to do that yet, because the problem is that the bandwidth varies. So like, let's say, you're on a computer sometimes it slows down for a little bit and then speeds up again. Or you're on a phone and it might be really slow, but then you go 10 feet away and all of a sudden it gets fast because you're in a better antenna position or something. So as it's querying, because your bandwidth isn't constant, there's not really a way that it can actually query and find that out. So that's something that everybody really wants to do. It would be so great if we could query bandwidth and send less things to slow browsers, but we can't do that yet. But my guess is, they're working on this. In a couple of years, that's probably going to be something that you can do. But for now, you can't. And you can't even really judge it by the size of the screen. Like, it's easy to say, a phone is going to be slower because it's on 3G and the desktop isn't a fast office. But that's not the case. You know, you might have your laptop, like I said, in a hotel room when you get slow internet all the time. Or you might have your phone in your home on Wi-Fi, so there's really no way of knowing by device size either. So, unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do with that. You have another question?
Yeah. All right. So, with M's and runs, which do you prefer using?
I like to use M's because you have this thing where you can make like a whole div bigger all at once, or something like that, so they're handy in that way, and they're not hard to use if you're thinking about it and being very careful about how you write your CSS. You can actually mix them. You don't need to use the same thing on a whole website, so there's some occasions where I'm using M's for everything, but there's one particular thing that needs to be a certain size, so I use M's for it. So, you know, you can, you know, if you know what you're doing, you can mostly use M's and occasionally use M's to get a certain effect.
Thanks.
Any more questions?
You were talking about CSS hyphens, and that only works in Safari and later versions of Internet Explorer, I believe, so it doesn't work in Chrome or Opera. Do you ever use soft hyphens? You know,
I don't know what's out there.
it's just a HTML character that you can put in, but you have to manually put it into the text. Say this is where a hyphen would go if you want to
Right.
make at this point.
So the question was using soft hyphens, which are, you can put in HTML and put like a thing in the middle of a word and say, a hyphen could go here if you wanted to put a hyphen here. And it works if you want to do it, but the problem is if you tried to do that for all your text, that would take such an incredible amount of time to manually put hyphens in everywhere that it's just not really feasible. But it's something to think about. For example, if you have like a heading or something like that that you want to hyphenate a specific way, you can put soft hyphens in there. So like on a very small scale, you might want to think about doing that if you're really picky about putting hyphens and things, but it's not realistic as an option.
It comes in handy when you have a really long word. You know this is going to cause a problem to put at least one soft hyphen somewhere in the middle where it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you see a place to do it, then do it, but especially if it's like a decentralized site where you have a lot of different people working on content, you really can't expect that they're going to be thinking about it. Any more questions? No? Okay, so this is my website. So the slides for the typography presentation are up there because I've done that one before. The slides for color aren't up yet because it's new, but it'll probably be up in a day or two. You can look for those slides online and download them. And then I'm on Twitter too. And if you think of questions later, you can contact me on Twitter or my website, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about responsive design. And this is the book. It's called Learning Responsive Design, and it's out now. And actually, if you want to buy it, I have little cards where you can get 40% off, and I'll be happy to get you one. And thanks for coming.